Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham. I'm the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're delighted to be hosting Dr. David Kessler, who's here to talk about his new book, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, the New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. David's one of the most distinguished medical and public health officials of the past few decades. He's a pediatrician by training, also has a law degree, and he headed the Food and Drug Administration for 6.5 years between 1990 and 1997, a period that spanned two presidents, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He went on to serve as dean of two medical schools, Yale and UCSF. President Biden brought him back into government to be chief science officer of the White House's COVID response team. In addition, he's written several previous books, including The End of Overeating, Capture, Your Food is Fooling You, Fast Carbs and Slow Carbs, and A Question of Intent. David begins his new book with good news. What he says is good news, and it is. He announces to those who have struggled with weight issues, which, let's face it, is quite a few of us, that dramatic and lasting weight loss is now possible thanks to highly effective anti-obesity medications. These drugs, David writes, have revolutionized our understanding of weight loss and of obesity itself. He then goes on in the book to examine how to achieve a healthy weight and to maintain it. The existence of new wonder drugs is just the start. It's one powerful tool, he says, that can be used to manage weight and health, but other tools, which have existed all along, remain important, including nutrition, behavioral therapies, and physical activity. So all must be considered as part of a comprehensive approach which David authoritatively and very helpfully elaborates on. He sorts through the scientific evidence and the hype about weight loss, and he offers lots of informed and illuminating guidance on how to develop a practical, sustainable pathway to better health. And, you know, for the price of just $32.99, that's a hard deal to beat. So I encourage everybody to get his book and get more copies and hand them to your friends and family. Now, in conversation with David will be Dan Diamond, who himself knows a lot about public health. He's a journalist for the Washington Post and previously for Politico, and he was covering public health for the Post until very recently. Just, I don't know, a few weeks ago, right, Dan, when he was reassigned to the White House, another low-pressure beat. But on top of that, he just had another child, just 18 days ago, something like, yeah. So anyway, nonetheless, he's here to help moderate. So please join me in welcoming David Kessler and Dan Diamond.
Thank you, Brad, and good to see you, Dr. Kessler. As Brad mentioned, it's an honor to be back at Politics and Prose for professional and personal reasons. We did just have a newborn at Sibley, and Doctor, I have found that accepting an invitation to do a book talk is the fastest way in Washington, D.C. to get face-to-face time with a pediatrician. So I hope you don't mind if I have a few questions while I'm up here. I do have about 40 minutes of questions about your book. Then we'll turn it over to questions from the crowd. And perhaps we could just start with this. I've covered you over the years. I covered you most intensely during the COVID response, which you helped lead. You left the Biden administration. This book became a priority for you. Can you maybe start with why this book and why now?
COVID was an intense period for all of us, fair? I think we all sort of are a little in denial the real effects it's had on us. If I had told you we would be locked down for months and we would work at our homes for 2 years. I mean, that's a profound, profound effect that I don't think we fully have come to grips with. But I found myself, working, 24/7 in front of my computer. In fact, the last time I was here speaking was March 28th, 2020. And I had a book come out that week, and there was no book tour then. There was nothing else on the book because I went in to work on COVID at that time. But I found myself after 2 years inside doing Warp Speed, having the opportunity to co-lead that, and really working around the clock. You and I talking throughout that.
Sometimes
period.
around the clock at like 1 a.m.
Exactly.
Yeah.
676 million vaccines on every corner, free, that really let us get to the other side of this pandemic. And we're here, and we made it through. I found myself some 40 pounds heavier after that intense period. And I just wanted to do a real dive into understanding weight. I had understood food and somewhat what was driving it in previous books, having done The End of Overeating about a decade earlier. But being 40 pounds heavier, I went on a low-carb diet, and after about 6 weeks, I lost about 6 pounds. But it wasn't going all that quickly. And I found myself, one evening in the Sibley ER with a kidney stone. And I mean, not to get too, into the weeds, all of a sudden, they drew my blood and I had an elevated calcium. Why did I have an elevated calcium? And they said, they were concerned about that elevated calcium, not the kidney stone. And they sent me to an endocrinologist. And I had decided to, I'd been working on the book. I had been studying these anti-obesity drugs. And the endocrinologist happened to be doing, clinical trials on the drug. And he said in the office, do you want to try the GLP-1s? And I figured if I was writing about obesity, let me try it. Let me live it.
So you did it for the book, or you did it for the?
I did it for both, very honestly. And a very, most important thing, if you're going to do this, I mean, these are chronic conditions leading to chronic disease, but the most important thing is you have to do it under very good care.
Well, maybe before we go deep on the GLP-1s, let's just talk about what you've learned over the years. Brad mentioned in his introduction, The End of Overeating, which came out in 2010. Fast Carbs, Slow Carbs, that came out 5 years ago. Are you, in some ways, depressed that some of the things that you warned about 15 years ago, The End of Overeating, it was a plan for people to control their diets. Some of that advice may have fallen by the wayside. There was a lot of overeating in the past decade. Are you depressed by the trajectory of what brought us to 2025? Or are you excited by the progress that obesity levels may have finally stopped rising?
So, not to beat up on public health, right? It's the last thing we want to do. I mean, it got us to the other side of this pandemic. But you can argue that this is one of the great failures, obesity, because we've known, what's driving this real pandemic for years. But
this pandemic of obesity.
I mean, this epidemic of obesity, certainly global in nature. But if you really think about it, what's strong enough? What's powerful enough? Why, in the face of this knowledge, do we find ourselves in such trouble, with this excess calorie, with this what I would call toxic fat? It's not about weight, right? It's certainly excess caloric intake. It's the type of food we're eating. What's powerful enough to have gotten into these, getting us into these problems? And only when you really understand it. And I didn't call it out in the end of overeating. I knew about fat, sugar, and salt. I knew about the reward pathways. We were I think one of the first, in that book to really focus on highly processed foods, and it stimulated, a whole generation of scientists over the last 15 years to study those reward pathways. But what is powerful enough, despite your not wanting to do it, cause this epidemic? And you realize that they really are addictive circuits in the brain. And we put fat, sugar, and salt on every corner, made it available 24/7, made it socially acceptable to eat anytime. We have a food carnival, in essence, a food circus there. What did we expect to happen? But why is it so hard to resist? And the fact is, they really are, the addictive circuits at play. I wasn't ready to say that, in 2009, 2010, but you study that and you realize maybe our view of addiction has to broaden, but in essence, this energy-dense food was the first addiction.
And you have an industry that has incentive to produce food that people find addictive.
So again, this is surreal in some ways.
This book talk?
Well, no, it's wonderful. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You were just so nice. Could you imagine having, the second one, 18 days, no sleep, and you came
I'm tired, but this is actually a break for me. This is great.
Right.
So, but we're here for you, so please, yeah.
When you think about this, you have one industry that's made, millions, if not billions, of dollars, putting this ultra-formulated food on every corner, getting us into this predicament. And now you have another industry making equally millions and billions of dollars to reverse what the first industry does.
The pharma industry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you were someone from another planet and you came down and saw that, right, you would go, that makes no sense. Right? But that's the hand that we're dealt with. It's not going to change anytime soon. And so what I think I tried to do, and what was important to me, leave everything in the environment, that is beyond our control. But for the first time, I think you can reclaim your health. Again, this is not about weight. This is about health.
In the book, you draw a comparison, the one you're making right now, or distinction, excuse me, the difference between our shape and what we look like versus what you say toxic, visceral fat. Can you explain to the audience what is toxic fat? What is visceral fat? How is it measured?
You're exactly right. This is the one thing that I care about, and I think this is driving this epidemic. And this, you did a whole series on life expectancy being, a number of years less in the United States than in our peer nations.
We did a series of the Washington Post about, yes, we are lagging behind these other advanced countries for a variety of reasons, and some has to do with obesity.
So we always knew that weight wasn't good for us. What we didn't understand, right, what was in the causal chain. And this is in the causal chain of cardiac disease. It's both atherosclerotic. It's heart failure. It's kidney disease. It's certainly diabetes. It's in 12, 13 forms of cancer. It's probably in some forms of neurodegenerative disease. The metabolic chaos that is caused by visceral adiposity. Visceral adiposity is the fat that accumulates in our abdomen. It's not the fat under your skin. It's not the fat in your thighs. Right? It's not that jiggly.
You can't necessarily see it by looking, is what you're saying.
You can see it. It's the fact is, that beer belly, right? That's visceral fat. That's primarily visceral fat. It is more metabolically active. Understand the problem aren't the fat cells, because fat holds on to fat and does its job. It's those fat cells in that abdominal cavity that have that leak out the fat. They're not as good as holding on to the fat, and they leak out free fatty acids. They leak out inflammatory molecules, adipokines and cytokines that are pro-inflammatory, that get into our liver, that get into our pancreas, get into layers of the heart, and cause real organ damage. If we can reduce, I mean, it's as big as tobacco, and I've spent my career focusing on tobacco. If you want to have an impact on the health of this country, visceral fat, that sick fat, that toxic fat, that occurs, and you see during menopausal transition, there's a shift in where that fat is located from that subcutaneous more into the abdominal cavity. I mean, that is driving chronic disease. If you want to make America healthy, right, that's the real way to make America healthy. Reduce the amount of visceral fat. That's what's killing us.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the oddity of now depending on the pharma industry to help reduce a problem brought by the different industry, the food industry. You made a decision 2 years ago to start taking a GLP-1. You've lost about 60 pounds, more or less, from the GLP-1. Can you just explain to folks here what was going through your mind in making the decision? Was it scary? Was it exciting? How did you feel about it?
I had studied these drugs. I try to learn everything, even when that clinical trial is offered those to go on those medicines. But what was very interesting to me is how these drugs work and sort them out. And I don't think the companies fully level with people on how they work. I mean, no doubt they're complicated. They're working both on the gut and they're working on the brain.
Okay, so level with us. How do they work?
Well, so there's only one way once you've accumulated excess, adiposity, I mean, that excess fat, to reduce that. Sorry, whether it's diet, whether it's drugs, or whether it's surgery, the only way to lose that weight is to be in an energy deficit situation. Right? They all work through less calories in than burned. Right? Now the problem is, eat less, exercise more. It didn't work because no one could do it because of the addictive circuits. But in the end, eating less and the type of foods, and we can talk about it, is absolutely key. But there's, the drug companies would like, and some of the docs, I mean, who do the clinical trial, think there's something magic about these pills, and they get angry at me when I said they're an appetite suppressant, but they really do work by reducing appetite. Now, how do they work? Right? What these drugs do, and they mimic a hormone that slows down gastric emptying. So your stomach holds on to food. Your intestines just aren't moving as much. So more food ends up in your stomach. Right? And what happens when more food ends up in your stomach? It's not emptying. You have, it makes you feel full. There's this cascade of fullness, satiety, that edge of nausea, right? More, and then there's outright distress. When Dan Drucker, who was, one of the discoverers of the GLP-1 initially, decades ago, when he was giving these drugs to laboratory animals, he would give the drugs, now, again, different forms, different doses, but the animals didn't move. Right? He coined the phrase, visceral malaise, right? Because food's ending in your stomach. I mean, I think we've all experienced this. When you have food poisoning or you have the flu, right? And food stays in your stomach, what don't you want to do? You don't want to put more food in your stomach, I mean, because there's going to be variability, and we all have different sensations. But what these drugs basically do is take you to the edge of nausea, and sometimes over that edge of nausea. And what's strong enough to reverse those or counter those addictive circuits? I mean, there are these aversive circuits. So you're balancing those addictive circuits with these aversive circuits. Now, the great thing about these drugs is that while they slow down gastric emptying, more food stays in your stomach, you're going to want to put less food in there. You have the opportunity to recondition how you eat. Right? Because if I'm going to, and again, everyone's going to be different. There are going to people say, I don't feel anything and I've lost weight. Other people say it makes me very sick. For me, it certainly took me to that edge of nausea. And I didn't want to put anything else, but I would condition myself. I would eat small portions. And by eating small portions, I'd learn to eat small portions. Now, the premise of these drugs, right, what the companies would like is for you to stay on these drugs your whole life. And maybe for some diabetics, they will do that. But the fact is, the data show that people are on these drugs for only 8 or 9 months. So one thing we know is if you go off these drugs, the vast majority of people are going to gain back the weight.
So why do people get off the drugs? Because they can't afford them? Because they can't tolerate them? Do we know?
Some it's coverage, some it's adverse events, some it's sheer cost, some it's drug burden. I don't want to be on a drug. I don't want to inject myself. I don't want to have this visceral malaise my whole life. But FDA approved these drugs under the sort of pretense that people were going to be on these drugs for their whole life. And the reality is people are only on these drugs for a number of months. So what's going to happen, right? I mean, we're going to turn around in 3 to 5 years unless we figure out how to use these in the real world and use these well as one tool, not again as this miracle. We're going to turn around in 3 or 4 years and find, well, people took this 8, 9 months, they lost weight, then they gained it back. We spent thousands of dollars, and this was one big failure. So it's absolutely essential because these are very powerful drugs. Right? It's very important we figure out how to use these well.
In the book, you talk about Ozempic, you talk about some of the other GLP-1s, and then the knockoffs, the compounded versions that can be less expensive. And at the same time, for all of these benefits, you acknowledge there might be some safety risk, especially for the millions of Americans who might be looking for cheaper alternatives. Do we know that these drugs are safe long-term? And how worried would you be if there was massive uptake among a broader population, people shopping online for cheaper alternatives to Ozempic?
So let's talk about the compounded drugs first, right? And talk about the safety. Again, I need not give...
And compounded drugs, for people who might not know, that might be like a company like Hims, for instance, that sells the cheaper alternative that you buy over the internet because they're making a version, essentially, of Ozempic.
Well, they are likely, let's not talk about any one company, but they are probably...
Apologies if there are regulators who are listening, but just trying to offer...
And they're lawyers. I'm just lawyering this.
Sure.
That's okay, right? Understand they're online platforms, right? So there are online platforms that are white label. So they will white label online platforms means they will hire some company, right, that's managing the docs, right? So that's one issue. And then they're sourcing these compounded versions, right? Now, they're not making these drugs, and in all likelihood, I mean, these drugs, these compounded versions, right, are being made, the active ingredient, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and I know something about this, having, run this little agency for 6, 7 years, right? These compounded drugs, the API is being made in China, primarily, or in and what you see is there's so many middlemen, and they take these drugs, these API, and they make smaller batches. There's so many people involved in that chain. Lilly and Novo Nordisk, look, I'm the last one to front for the pharmaceutical industry, and I think most people, in this town know that, right? Again, enormous respect for what they've accomplished. They have strong controls over their manufacturers. The compounded versions, I mean, it's very hard to know even where these are being made. And the FDA is not inspecting or testing this. I mean, FDA wasn't doing that even before the recent events, and it's certainly not doing that now, and doesn't have the resources to even check the imports. But what this is, I mean, think about this for a second, right? I need not give this audience, any more reason to, to recognize that we have the most screwed up healthcare system one could imagine. But you have these drugs being priced at, in essence, exorbitant prices. For what they cost. Yes, they are entitled to research and development. Yes, they come up with discoveries. Yes, innovation is key. Yes, we depend on the pharmaceutical. But there are excess, very high prices, right? And so what happened, for people who can't access that, right? Medicare is not paying for them. The vast majority of health insurances are not covering them, certainly for weight loss. So people in this country had to revert to in order to get this drug, to go to a version of this drug that's being made in China that you don't even know where the source is, and you can't vouch for it. Now, in response to these compounded versions, the pharmaceutical companies all of a sudden said, oh, well, we better do something, we've got to lower the price. So you see this compounding, these market dynamics, are just so bizarre, and so the reverse incentives. But it's no way to run a healthcare industry. In order to provide access, you have to go to substandard Chinese versions.
So to paraphrase what I'm hearing, in the manufacturing, you have more trust in the Eli Lilly's, the Novo Nordisks than the compounded ones. But there's still this.
That's verified. There's something called a drug master file at FDA. Those plants get inspected. That's very different than this compounded version. But it's the healthcare system that is creating the incentives for these compounded versions to come out, because no one's pricing these drugs reasonably to begin with.
Setting aside the compounding versus the branded, I think I'm still curious. Do we know if the GLP-1s, which have taken America by storm and so many people are using them, you're using them, do we really know?
I go on them and I go off them, and I don't have the data to know whether that's even safe, right? The agency has to require us to use these drugs in the real world, right? Because I don't know whether you can do that, whether tolerance will build up over time. We have to study these drugs as they're being used and find safer ways that people can go off, whether they can go off these drugs, can they use these drugs intermittently, but they have a demonstrable effect on visceral fat, right? And that can change your health.
I guess we'll find out in 20 years whether this was all good. There's a part of your book that you talk about the rewards that you would get from eating over the years. And I think a lot of us could probably identify with this, that you would reward yourself with a favorite piece of cake. I know that when I've done something that I'm proud of and I'm exhausted, I might order from one of my favorite restaurants. But in the book, you talk about how your appetites changed after the GLP-1 and some of the risks of going after those sorts of rewards. Can we take this too far? Like, are we at risk of, if we get rid of the fat and sugar and salt that make us fat, are we also at risk of depriving ourselves of some of the pleasures of life?
I think, I am very concerned about the GLP-1s and eating disorders, because I think there's a lot of unexplored questions about when you have something that's that powerful that takes down appetite. But I think your question is really very key. I can only study myself, and I could read what's in the literature, but I found that I was using food to change how I feel. These momentary blips throughout the day, right? So if I was agitated, I would eat to calm down. If it's 10 o'clock at night and I know I got to keep on working for another 2-3 hours and I needed that cognitive focus, right, I would eat. So I was eating to change how I felt. And what's the other thing that you do if you look at throughout the day? These normal, ups and downs of everyday existence, right, that make us uncomfortable, that we try to alter. My guess is if I had been born 2 or 3 decades earlier, I would have been a smoker. Right? Because if you look at how people use nicotine, throughout the day, I mean, in essence, I grazed throughout the day with food. People grazed with nicotine throughout the day. Now, it's very important when I talk about addiction in the book and grappling with it, I'm not talking about the levels of dopamine you get with amphetamine or cocaine. But I think and we still have a lot more to work out the neurocircuitry. But certainly how I was using food and how people use nicotine, I think those are, I think there's similar neurobiology.
Well, I take notice when you say that because, as the audience might know, you helped lead the fight on the tobacco industry 30 years ago. And now you are drawing a comparison. You draw it in the book, you're drawing it in our talk between cigarettes and food. And I flagged a conversation you had in the book with Professor Pale. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name. But you write, I was struck by the parallels between the strategies used in food marketing and those used in cigarette marketing. And then you go on to talk about how, say, Frosted Flakes are promoted and other foods are promoted in ways that can be misleading and encourage uptake in dangerous ways. So on the one hand, I think I'm curious, do you truly think that that's a fair comparison? Frosted Flakes, Marlboro Lights, like, should we really be lumping those together? And second, how do we crack down if this really is a danger, the food advertising?
So we went to Professor Pale, he's emeritus now in British Columbia, because he was the great expert, on tobacco marketing. And he was key in our efforts to regulate marketing to young people. He got this. He talks about something that is called virtue signaling. Right? So if you want to sell a product that changes how people feel, especially, you look at how they market the virtues, but they don't tell you the downside, right? And how the advertising focuses you on the pluses. So I just went to him. He knew nothing about food, right? He knew everything about tobacco, and we took out decades worth of food advertising. And he went, oh my gosh, there it is. The same strategies are being used.
So how do we crack down on that? For instance, in the book, you talk about one positive idea, the nutritional box on packaged foods, which you helped oversee at the FDA 30 years ago. But in the telling of you and Professor Pale, that has been hacked. That is some of the virtue signaling, correct? The idea that it's all the positives of what might be in the food, but none of the drawbacks. So how do we fix that?
So what we missed, I think at the time, the food label really was sort of stage 1, chapter 1 in transparency of what's in the food, right? And it does a very good job of telling you what's in the food. There's nothing about telling you what the biological effects of those foods are on your body, right? There is my most favorite chapter in the book is, I have a chapter called "You Couldn't Have Designed a Better Weapon." Right? If you just look at a blueberry versus a blueberry muffin, right? It's one thing to know the fat, sugar, protein content of an ingredient, but when you think about it, that blueberry, that structure of that food with the fiber, right? How that blueberry exists in nature, and that absorption of the sugars, the glucose from that, it's slowly absorbed. Put that blueberry, cook it, put it in a sea of starch, of oils, of other sugars, and you find that the rise in glucose, is that, sorry, I won't show any slides on pharmacokinetics, I promise you, but it's that rise, of that glucose, right, that is demonstrably different when when you're eating that blueberry, because it's that structure holds on to that glucose, right? Compared to when you destroy that structure in that ultra formulated, energy dense food. And that rapid rise of glucose, that effect on our metabolism, I think has basically overwhelmed our bodies. I mean, there are the addictive circuits, but you also have to understand the metabolic biology at play. There is an epidemic, and no one talks about this, but there is an epidemic over the last 20 years of hyperinsulinemia. Now, we can't quite, that's elevated insulin levels. Now, we can't quite, visceral fat is the culprit, and I can't quite sort out whether that hyperinsulinemia, is occurring before the visceral fat or occurring after the visceral fat, but there is this vicious cycle, right? And you take this ultra-processed, energy-dense, high glycemic food, and you just put it in your stomach, and it gets absorbed, at the rate. That is just adding fuel, to anyone, right, who has this elevated liver insulin levels and is causing this chronic disease. The dietary guidelines were written for a healthy body, right? The American body, for the vast majority of us, are not healthy. Only about 15% of us have normal metabolic indices.
You are not the only person in Washington talking about unhealthy Americans. I read the book. I didn't see the name Donald Trump, our president, didn't see RFK Jr., our health secretary, but they have teamed up on an initiative that we've reported on, Make America Healthy Again. Are they actually making America healthier? Anything that they're doing that you would point to?
So what's interesting is they listed two anti-lipid lowering drugs. If you look at the president's most recent physical, he's on rosuvastatin and ezetimibe. That's intensive lipid lowering therapy. His LDL-C went from 143 to 51. He's getting very good care. And please understand.
So they're making the president healthier, is what you're saying.
But here's the real pitch. Those drugs, that basic science, was undertaken by Brown and Goldstein, funded by the NIH. So he is benefiting personally from the great NIH research. So please, right? In the end, those cuts on the NIH and in the biomedical sciences, that has to stop. Look, there's no doubt, the elephant in the room. RFK Jr., there's no doubt he is tapped into this populist notion. There's no doubt that there is a great deal of concern about chronic disease. There's no doubt that this ultra-formulated foods, are a major part of the reason it's leading to this chronic disease. The problem is every tactic that they're using to approach that is just wrong. So they're just off. And the one thing we know about, this town, correct me if I'm wrong, if you want to tackle something, you just got to get it right. Focusing the anti-vaccine stuff, the attacks on medical research, even the food dye stuff, no matter how laudable that is, that's not where the problem, that's not going to solve this problem. Yes, this ultra-formulated food is the problem. It's driving visceral adiposity, but that's what we have to be able to fix.
We are getting to the point of Q&A. There's a microphone up here if folks would like to start queuing up. And while people are making their way, I'll ask one more question, Doctor. You mentioned President Trump's medical report. He's lost a fair amount of weight in recent weeks. The White House has not said he's on a GLP-1. You're an expert. Is there anything in his medical report that would suggest that he is?
You're now White House. You have the White House speak?
Yes, but I've been on paternal leave for a couple of weeks, so I'm completely checked out.
Why don't you ask him when he returns?
I'll see what I can do.
They've not denied it. Let's put it this way. They've not said he is on it, right? But they've not denied it. So I can tell you here's the data. You can lose about 5 to 7% of your weight just by diet, right? That's tens. I mean, some people, there's great variability. They lose hundreds of pounds, right? I mean, some in the White House press corps say he's lost 30. I mean, you can do the math. I do note that what happened. I mean, what bizarre. I mean, the Saudis had a 18-wheeler that was made into a McDonald's. I mean, did this really happen? I mean, it followed him around in Saudi Arabia. So it doesn't sound like he's changed his diet. So if he's losing weight, I mean, you can ask the question when you're back.
Okay, well, of top priority. We'll go to the microphone, and there are a lot of folks.
But it is a teachable moment. There shouldn't be. Look, if he's losing weight, it's great. He's taking care of his lipids, that's great. Everybody should be able to do that. There shouldn't be any shame or stigma attached.
Everyone should follow President Trump's lesson, is what I'm hearing. Let's go to the microphone.
Yes,
Lots of questions.
Maybe they'll get a jet if they follow his example, a free jet. I think I worked for you. My first job out of law school was in the chief counsel's office at the FDA, where I worked on food labels. I was responsible for the asterisk that said, this product has no important minerals or vitamins, so they wouldn't have to list 17 zeros. And I got sick of law, and I became a doctor. And I wrote, there was a report from NIH around 2015 on obesity, and it said what we need to do is eat less and exercise more. By that time, I'd become a physician, a primary care physician, and that doesn't work unless you have iron will, like you did when you did your first book talk here and talked about how you lost weight that way. Nobody loses weight that way. My question is, the metabolic set point theory, that when you've been overweight for a fair amount of time, your body responds when you start to lose weight, that it's starving. If you lose more than 10% of your weight, your body thinks it's starving, all the counter-regulatory hormones turn on, and you can't lose any more weight unless you have an iron will like you must have had back then. Is that still the case?
So thanks for the asterisk. And thanks for working on the food label. It's very redundant, very complicated. Redundant, I mean, there's just multiple different pathways at work. And there are both addictive circuits, right, and metabolic circuits.
Okay.
The reason and I've done this, and you point this out, I have gained and lost my body weight repeatedly, right? And I used to think, right, after I lost the weight, I was done. And that was the mistake. This is a chronic condition. And why did I always gain it back? And that's why I wanted to do this book, and to understand that mystery. The book doesn't, the goal of the book was to just be a comprehensive book that, went into the science of this mystery of weight. Okay? I think it's the addictive circuits, the fact is, and the metabolic circuits. I think there's addictive circuits at play and metabolic adaptation. And the reason we regain, to me, that's just relapse. The addictive circuits are still there, as well as there's metabolic adaptation.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm an obesity physician for 15 years, and so these drugs, I agree, are miracles. I want to emphasize two things. You have to exercise while you're on them, strength train, and eat well. I think those are the people that lose a lot of weight. But what I'm seeing the last couple of years now are people that are almost normal weight requesting to go on these drugs. Some of them do have prediabetes, but I'm very uncomfortable, not using the guidelines or putting them on, say, for example, for people that just want to lose 10 or 15 pounds. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
So there's a chapter in the book that deals exactly with that question. It was a physician, who wanted to lose 20 pounds. I mean, first of all, I don't want to be judgmental. I mean, right? We shouldn't. I mean, this is such a fraught subject. It's so hard to talk about, right? So we have to be just having the conversation. Right? So if people want to lose it, I think we have to engage seriously. The question: are the risks acceptable in light of the benefits? So if you have 20 pounds to lose, right? Most obesity docs are going to say, "Don't go near these medicines." Right?
I don't know if that's so. I'm just saying.
But, no, but if you look at the guidelines, most
Right,
of them will say, "Hey,
Let's
this."
wait.
So the question is, I mean, there are real adverse events. I mean, let's just go through them just for a second because you're a pro at this. The average person on these drugs while they're losing weight, what's your guess? How many calories are they eating if they're on tirzepatide in the first couple of months of this? What do you think?
The lowest dose, or
No, once you titrate them up,
probably
and
12 to 1,500 something.
calories.
Like that. Yeah.
My sense is, if you look at some of the data, some of these patients are on less than 1,000 calories.
Or maybe 1,000 to 12,
Right.
1,500.
I mean, and you talk
depending
some of the
upon their size, of course.
right. I mean, you run the risk below 1,000 calories of malnutrition.
Malnutrition. Of course.
Malnutrition. There's dehydration. There's euglycemic acidosis. So there's real risks of malnutrition. The question is, are those risks, and there's a real risk of, if there's delayed gastric emptying, delayed motility, there's increased constipation. Intestinal obstruction is a real adverse event, potentially. When are those potential adverse events justifiable in light of the benefits? I think the issue is not 10 or 20 pounds. The issue is visceral adiposity. If you have some of the metabolic complications, I mean, if I give you a patient, who has
I guess I
elevated
should have-
triglycerides
Yeah,
and lowered HDL, and they have high blood pressure, and they have a family history of cardiac disease, and their body composition, their 30+%, body fat, and they want to lose 20 pounds. I mean, it's not the weight. It's that amount of visceral
Right.
adiposity.
I guess I
Fair?
should have preempted it by saying if they're healthy and they want to lose. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll read the chapter.
to me, it's about health. I mean, these are really powerful drugs that have real adverse events. You should only do it if the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks. Again, I don't want to be judgmental, but use these drugs. And the most important thing is, if you're going to consider doing this, the most important thing is get good care. I mean, some of these there's some very good teledoc services, right? But some of them are spending more than just a minute looking at these records. The most important thing, it's a chronic condition. You need good medical care, and you need good nutrition dietitian care if you're going to do this, because it is for the long haul.
And for legal reasons, we're not going to mention any of those telemedicine ones that are questionable. Next question.
Just wanted to ask about what I see as a recent trend to increase the protein content of foods, which on the surface of it would seem like a really great thing. Makes you wonder why they weren't doing it even before. In a lot of cases, the source of the protein is plant protein rather than animal protein. Do you see does it seem like a good trend to you, or that you see any risks in that? Breakfast cereal is a particularly good example of this, but there are other kinds of foods. They're boosting the protein content, usually with bean extracts and so forth.
And just to repeat that, if folks couldn't quite hear, boosting the protein content of food, the trend, is that a good thing?
So one of the questions is it the protein, the increase in protein, or is it what's you're taking out? If you have increased protein, you have less fat and carbohydrates, which may be driving this, or is it the protein? There is considerable evidence that the protein increases satiety, right? Which increases fullness, and it isn't as stimulating. So these higher protein diets, are effective tools. Again, nothing works in the long haul, right? But higher protein diets, some argue that increase in satiety, that fullness you get from the GLP-1s on the Astrip has done work that has shown that higher protein, are similar to the effects of the GLP-1s. So there is an effectiveness there. I think it's, again, it's this satiety, it's this cascade that's
Right.
important. It gets you to eat less.
You don't see a downside of too much protein, of uric acid or gout or whatever.
Yeah. So again, I want to avoid practicing medicine, politics and prose, but we have to understand there's great variability, and I think in general most people are not going to get into trouble, but some will. In there.
Thanks.
Interesting question. Next question.
Hello. So my question's more related to just addiction in general. So I'm 8 years sober. Thankfully, I had access to a very modern, holistic approach for my addictions. However, it was so expensive and very few people have access. With all of this great new information, how do we incorporate it into the existing support systems for addiction, which are really outdated? Like, so in most communities, it's pretty much the 12 steps, which is from the 1930s. So do you see any movement and anything happening with like how this research can help more people who are in like, I'm from Idaho, so it's just like, that's it. You're going to a church and you're going to the 12 steps. And then like, that's not working for many people. So how do we see this actually helping more people in a community and trying to changing the systems of support?
So thanks for the question. The most important thing is this is not about, willpower. This is not about people being weak. This is not about I think that, and the book tries to grapple with this and this shift in a little bit in the paradigm of how we think about addiction. Addiction is not the result of a maladaptive brain. It's when the brain is working almost too well. In this energy-dense, food carnival that we're living, we're all wired to focus on the most salient stimuli in our environment that changes how we feel. And the brain, those addictive circuits are in all of us. And the real question is, what are we going to be captured by? For some of it's going to be ultra-formulated food because we want to use that to change how we feel. Others, it's going to be drugs. Others going to be shopping. So we all get captured. And I think we have to, the goal of the book was to have people rethink about addiction, not as something, yes, it's biology, but that biology is part of our species.
Yeah, I really hope this helps end the stigma that's associated with getting help. Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. William Davis wrote a book some time ago called Wheat Belly. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but what do you think of his theories that he advanced regarding wheat in our diets?
I think that there's something absolutely essential about that. Again, I'm convinced there's an epidemic of hyperinsulinemia. Putting more refined carbohydrates into a body that is, has an increased sense rises to insulin is only going to stimulate metabolic chaos. I think that the dietary guidelines, were written for the healthy body. America does not have, on average, a healthy body. I think those refined carbohydrates through that hyperinsulinemia is the problem. This country was founded on wheat, but we took it to a new level in how we processed it, and pouring it, that rapidly absorbable glucose into a body that have these insulin spikes, I think is probably underlying much of our chronic disease.
He also mentions whole grains as being problematic as well. What is your take on that?
So the problem is there's very few things as whole grains. Most of those whole grains really are refined, and just added back. They're composed to make sure they have all the components. But once you change that structure, everything is the rate of rise, that absorption from the gut, into our bloodstream. And if you're just stimulating this hyperinsulinemia, this rapidly absorbable glucose, you make, the whole grains, again, whole grains are great if there's really structure that's going to decrease that absorption. If it's highly processed whole grains, it's of little use from a health perspective.
We're coming up on 4, so maybe we can try and fit in 2 more questions if we go quickly.
Especially from this person.
Yeah, right. So I grew up, my siblings and I, being told about finishing everything on our plate because of the starving Armenians. Other people may have grown up with the Chinese or the Indians. I really took it to heart. You finish everything on your plate, whether you like it or not, whether it's a big portion or a small portion, whether you're full or not. I'm not looking to these drugs, but I'm wondering how you change those kinds of ingrained habits that lead to trouble.
So Darcy Bacon, who was Diane Ream's, producer for decades, great to see you.
Great to see you.
I am absolutely convinced when you're dealing with powerful stimuli that change how we feel. Again, I'm going back to the tobacco analogy, and I want to be careful. But, how did we win this battle on cigarettes, right? It's dramatic. It was one of the great public health, successes, certainly over the last number of decades. Yes, laws played a role. Yes, regulation played a role. Yes, taxes, those were all important. But in the end, no one's going out, having a cigarette here. Very different, today than 40, 50 years ago. When you're dealing with a salient stimuli, what is that valence? How is it viewed? Certainly in my parents' and my grandparents' generation, that tobacco was viewed as positively valenced. It was sexy, it was glamorous, it was going to make me feel better. I needed it, I wanted it. It was positively valenced. What did we do as a country? We changed that valence of how we view that cigarette, right? No longer is it my friend going to make me feel good, but we called it for what it was. And it took decades to change that perception. So it got viewed negatively valenced as a deadly addictive product. What's on my plate? How do I perceive it? Do I need that? It's triggering my brain, but again, what is my perception? When I'm taking these GLP-1s and my stomach's full, I'm going to go, oh, I don't want any more food. But there's an artificiality to that. But what's really important is how do we view these foods? When you go home tonight and you just turn on TV, you don't realize, and you're bombarded with all these TV commercials. Look at what they're advertising and all this, highly processed, high glycemic, energy-dense, ultra-formulated foods. There's no structure to it. It's just pouring this rapidly absorbable glucose, in overwhelming amounts that are triggering this hyperinsulinemia. You look at that and you go, oh, I don't want that. And that's where we got to get this country to get it. It's that perception. It's getting that information out. It is, that beer belly. Sorry, that's not cool. That's killing you, right? So again, there is how I think we understand this at a much different level, and I think we have to change that. Is that critical perceptual shift?
And a message that could be shared on Diane Ream's show. Maybe if we have one quick last question and one quick answer.
Hi. I was just curious, for those that do go on GLP-1 therapies, when you say the importance of having good medical care, what do you mean by that? And what should make up good medical care to support these individuals that go on the therapies? Thank you.
Great, a great question. These are powerful drugs. They have risks. They have benefits. This is shared decision-making between a doctor and a patient. These drugs are not for everybody. You need somebody who is skilled, who is going to be able to have that discussion with somebody and to weigh those risks and benefits and to know how to use these drugs wisely, to start low on dose, to go slow on dose titration, how to handle. I mean, if these drugs are just taking you to that edge of nausea, the last thing you want to do is go overboard, right? I mean, it takes real skill to get there, and then to make sure that there's no untoward event. But the most important thing is to recognize that there is no one tool that's going to work for the duration. This is a lifelong condition. You have to use multiple tools. But docs who are trained and dietitians who are trained in this, who are spending their lives on this, especially the most complicated question is, what do you do about adolescence, right? Are you going to put a kid on this, talking as a pediatrician, for their lifetime? That's one of the hardest questions. You need people who are very skilled. They're learning a lot about these drugs. There's a lot of answers that we still need FDA and the FDA to make sure the companies get that data. But please, please, these drugs are too powerful to just go wing it. The way we're doing it in this country, that you can just call an 800 number, see a doc for a minute, and go on this, that's not good medical care.
Well, Dr. Kessler, thank you so much. The book is Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine. And
Thank you. Thanks.
My pleasure. And for those who didn't get to ask questions, you're signing books, and I'm sure you'd welcome any more questions, correct?
Thanks for doing this thing.
So copies of David's book are available.